Have you ever wondered how many lives were lost, not because of the enemy, but because of a tank so badly designed, so hopelessly engineered, that even its own crew prayed it would never see combat? Today we pull the curtain back on the tanks that should never have been built, the machines that broke down before reaching the battlefield, burst into flames when hit by a spark, or trapped their crews in steel coffins they couldn't escape. These weren't just bad tanks. These were disasters on tracks. World War II created some of the most legendary armored vehicles the world has ever known. The Tiger, the Panther, the T-34, the Sherman. But behind the legends lurked another story, the machines that failed. The tanks that governments rushed into production with no testing. The tanks that engineers begged their commanders not to use. The tanks that soldiers feared more than enemy fire. Our countdown begins with a story buried in mud, smoke, and broken steel. A story of ambition, desperation, and catastrophic design failures. And to understand just how bad some of these tanks were, we must return to the early days of the war, when Europe was collapsing and armies were scrambling to mechanize faster than their factories could function. Before the world's engineers perfected armored warfare, the battlefield was littered with experiments. Tiny two-man tanks. Machines so underpowered they couldn't climb a hill. Turrets that jammed, guns that cracked when fired, armor so thin it could be pierced by rifle rounds. Some tanks burned when a spark hit their fuel lines. Others shook themselves apart while moving. And the poor soldiers inside them, well, they had the terrible job of pretending these vehicles were actually weapons instead of rolling scrap metal. Let's begin with one of the most infamous failures, the Italian Carro Armato L6 of 40. Italy entered World War II with bold dreams of armored might. But reality was another story. The L640 was small, painfully slow, and armed with a 20mm autocannon that struggled to penetrate even light armor. Against British Crusader tanks or Matildas, it may as well have been shooting pebbles. Its armor was so thin that even machine gun rounds could cripple it at close range. The tank's engine overheated constantly in desert heat, and its tracks snapped on rough terrain. Crews often abandoned it before battle even began. Soldiers joked that the L640 wasn't a tank, it was an armored apology. But as bad as Italy's light tanks were, they weren't the only offenders. Across the ocean, the United States quietly produced a catastrophe of its own, the M3 Lee. On paper, the Lee looked impressive. A tall multi-gun design with a 75mm cannon mounted in the hull and a 37mm gun in a rotating turret on top. In practice, it was a nightmare. The main gun couldn't rotate, meaning the entire tank had to turn its body to aim. Its height made it the easiest target on any battlefield. And because the large cannon was mounted low, the tank could barely fire over obstacles. In the deserts of North Africa, German gunners called it the lighthouse, because it stood out long before anything else on the horizon. The M3 may have been important early in the war, but no one pretended it was good. Yet even these tanks looked competent compared to what came next. When France began preparing for war in the 1930s, it created the R-35, a tank designed for trench warfare, not modern mechanized combat. Its armor was thick for its size, but everything else was hopeless. Its speed was slower than a jogging soldier. Its turret was so cramped that the commander had to load the gun, fire it, aim it, and lead the entire tank at the same time. And its 37mm cannon couldn't penetrate the frontal armor of German tanks that appeared in 1940. Many R-35s broke down before reaching the front lines. Those that did were destroyed in minutes. The tank wasn't just outdated, it was an antique the moment it rolled out of the factory. But the worst offenders weren't always the weakest. Some nations built tanks that failed not because they were light, but because they were too heavy, too complicated, too ambitious for their own good. The Soviet Union discovered this the hard way with the T-35, a massive, 5-turret monster built to intimidate enemies at parades. It looked terrifying, but in combat it was a joke. Its engine couldn't move its enormous frame without overheating. Its transmission failed constantly. Its armor plate, though thick, was brittle and cracked under fire. Most T-35s were abandoned and destroyed by their own crews before ever seeing a German tank. The mighty land battleship turned out to be nothing more than a steel circus act. But Germany had its share of engineering disasters as well. Early in the war, the Panzer I rolled onto the battlefield wearing armor so thin that it could be pierced by a rifle bullet. This wasn't even an exaggeration. Spanish Civil War reports documented this repeatedly. The tank's tiny 13mm machine guns were nearly useless against anything with real armor. And worst of all, the Panzer I was sent into battle anyway, because Germany was desperate to field tanks even when they had nothing suitable. Crews called it the coffin, and for many, that name was tragically accurate. And still, the list gets worse. Every nation had failures. Every army fielded machines that never should have left the drawing board. Some tanks were cursed by design flaws. Others were crippled by rushed production. And others were doomed simply because they were born into a war that evolved faster than their creators anticipated. But among all these failures, all these metal monsters that disappointed, malfunctioned, or murdered their own crews, one tank stands above the rest. A machine so infamous, so catastrophically unreliable, that it has been called the worst tank of World War II by nearly every historian who studies armored warfare. And that tank is coming from the shocking failures of early war armored design. You might think no tank could embarrass its own army more than the machines we just examined. But if the early battlefield disasters taught the world anything, it was this. Every nation entered the war with at least one armored vehicle that never should have left the drawing board. And nowhere is that more painfully true than with the Italian Carro Armato L640, a tank that didn't just perform poorly, it practically defined the phrase, unfit for combat. If the previous machines failed because they were outdated or poorly executed, the L640 failed because it was born into the wrong war entirely. It was a tank designed for a world that no longer existed, a world of slow infantry advances, lightly armed opponents, and battles fought at walking pace. But World War II was not that world. Blitzkrieg had changed everything. Armor needed speed, firepower, and survivability. The L640 had none of these. From a distance, the tank might have looked respectable. Up close, it became obvious. This was not a weapon of war. This was a compromise made in steel. Thin armor wrapped around a cramped hull. A tiny two-man crew forced to fight, drive, aim, and somehow survive all at once. And on top, the heart of the tank, a 20mm autocannon that struggled to penetrate even lightly armored vehicles. Against British Crusaders or Matildas, the L640 wasn't a tank. It was a target. Italian crews learned this the hard way the moment they rolled into North Africa. Under the brutal desert sun, engines overheated, tracks snapped, and the L640 broke down long before it broke the enemy. British gunners sometimes didn't even bother firing an armor-piercing round. A well-placed burst from a heavy machine gun was often enough to cripple it. Imagine being inside that tank, hearing bullets punching through the armor that was supposed to protect you. Imagine firing your main gun at an enemy tank and watching the shells bounce off like pebbles thrown at a fortress. And yet, despite all this, the L640 kept being sent into battles it could not win. Crews did their best with what they had, but every engagement was a reminder of Italy's industrial limitations. Even the Germans, who were supposed allies, took one look at the L640 and refused to use it in frontline combat. To them, it wasn't a tank at all. It was a liability. They stripped many of them for parts, repurposed them for training, or used them in rear-duty roles where the only enemy was boredom. But perhaps the most tragic part of the L640's story is that it never had a chance. It was outdated on the day it was designed. It was obsolete on the day it rolled out of the factory. And on the battlefield, it was nearly suicidal to operate. The crews who fought in them understood something their commanders did not. This machine would not save them. More often than not, it would fail them. The Carro Armato L640 wasn't just a bad tank. It was the wrong tank, built for the wrong war, deployed in the wrong place at the wrong time. And yet, as unbelievable as it might sound, things were about to get even worse. Because the next tank on our list didn't just disappoint its own soldiers. It actively endangered them. It was a tank designed by a major world power, fielded in huge numbers, and used in some of the most critical battles of the war. And yet, looking back, historians agree, this machine may have caused more frustration, more breakdowns, and more needless deaths than almost any other tank of the conflict. And that tank is coming next. If the Italian L-640 was a tank designed for a war that had already passed, then the next machine on our list was a tank designed for a war that no one fully understood yet. A tank that tried to be everything at once, and ended up failing at nearly everything. It was bulky, awkward, overcomplicated, and unmistakably American. This is the story of the M3 Lee, a tank so flawed that even its own crews had trouble believing it was meant for combat. The M3 Lee did not begin as a bad idea. In fact, it began as a desperate one. When the United States entered the armored arms race in 1940, the world was changing faster than American factories could adapt. Europe was burning. France had fallen. Britain was fighting alone. The U.S. Army needed a tank fast, something with a big gun that could destroy German armor until more advanced designs were ready. The solution they created was the M3, a tank that looked as though it had been designed by committee after a long night and too much coffee. Its most absurd feature was obvious the moment you saw it. A massive 75mm cannon mounted in the hull, unable to rotate. The idea was simple: put a powerful gun on the battlefield as quickly as possible. But the result was that the tank had to turn its entire body to aim. In the chaos of battle, that was a death sentence. And if that were not strange enough, the M3 also carried a smaller turret on top with a 37mm cannon, meaning it had two guns firing in different directions. It looked like something out of a cartoon, a child's drawing come to life, a patchwork of ideas welded into one towering machine. The tank was enormous, over 3 meters tall, making it one of the easiest vehicles in the world to spot on the horizon. German gunners called it the priest, because the silhouette reminded them of a man standing at a pulpit. British crews, who received dozens of Lees under Lend-Lease, gave it a different nickname, the lighthouse. Because once an M3 appeared on the battlefield, everyone saw it. But size alone wasn't the problem. The interior was a nightmare. 7 men cramped together, shouting over each other, trying to coordinate 2 main guns, 3 machine guns, and an engine that roared like an airplane. The commander, instead of commanding, was constantly distracted by the turret gun. The gunner of the hull cannon had almost no visibility. The driver struggled to maneuver the tank because the transmission was stubborn, the tracks were narrow, and the suspension bucked like a wild horse over uneven ground. Then came the desert. In 1942, the M3 Lee entered combat in North Africa, the place where tanks were tested brutally by sand, heat, and the legendary German 88mm gun. The results were predictable. The Lee's tall profile made it impossible to hide. Rommel's forces spotted them easily and fired first. A single 88mm round could turn a Lee into blazing scrap metal in seconds. Worse still, the hull-mounted main gun limited the tank's firing angles so severely that M3 crews sometimes had to reposition the entire vehicle just to get a shot off. In tank warfare, time is life. The Lee needed too much time. And yet, the crewmen inside those tanks fought bravely, making the best out of a machine that was never meant to be permanent. They learned to use the 75mm gun from behind cover. They learned to angle the hull to widen their firing arc. They learned, painfully, which German weapons could turn them into cold steel coffins. But no amount of training could fix the design. In technical assessments performed after the North African campaign, one British officer wrote bluntly, "The M3 Lee is not a tank. It is a stopgap. And we are stopping in the wrong gap." Even American crews knew the machine was flawed. Many complained that the tank felt awkward, top-heavy, and unstable, a vehicle built by engineers who had never fought inside one. It was something the US produced because they needed a tank immediately, not because it was the right tank. The Lee's final humiliation came when the M4 Sherman arrived. Balanced. With a rotating 75mm turret that actually made sense. The Sherman didn't need a second gun or a second turret. It understood the lessons the Lee failed to teach. It became the backbone of Allied armor, while the Lee slipped quietly into the background. But the M3 Lee leaves behind an unforgettable lesson in the history of armored warfare. A tank is not just a gun with tracks. It is a system of mobility, survivability, and efficiency. And when a tank tries to do too much, it ends up doing nothing well. The M3 Lee tried to fill two roles at once, and filled neither. It tried to solve a shortage, and created new problems. It tried to fight a modern war, and reminded everyone that rushed engineering can cost lives. But however flawed the M3 Lee was, our journey into the worst tanks of World War II is far from over. Because the next tank on our list didn't just struggle on the battlefield. It was obsolete before it even reached one. When you're ready, the next disaster of World War II armor awaits. If the M3 Lee was a tank that failed because it tried to be too many things, then the next tank in our journey failed for the opposite reason. It didn't try anything new. It clung stubbornly to old ideas that belonged to the previous war, not the one racing toward it at lightning speed. And when the Germans unleashed Blitzkrieg, the Renault R-35 stood frozen in time, a steel monument to outdated thinking. The R-35 was France's most numerous tank at the start of World War II, and on paper, that sounded impressive. Tens of thousands of men, hundreds of armored vehicles. A nation that remembered the horrors of the First World War and vowed never to be outmatched again. But the R-35 represented a fundamental misunderstanding about what a tank needed to be in modern warfare. To French military planners of the 1930s, the tank was not a spearhead. It was a walking shield. A companion to infantry. A slow-moving guardian meant to support foot soldiers, cross trenches, and survive machine gun fire. And in a very narrow sense, the R-35 fit that role. It had thick armor for its size, thick enough to resist many small-caliber weapons of the era. But armor without mobility is a prison, and armor without firepower is a tomb. The Renault R-35 was painfully slow. At top speed, it barely outran a man on a bicycle. Its tiny engine groaned under the weight of its armor, overheating on long marches, stalling when pushed too hard, and refusing to start at critical moments. But mobility was only one problem. The turret told the rest of the tragic story. Inside that small, cramped dome sat a single man, the commander, who was expected to aim the gun, load the gun, fire the gun, spot targets, coordinate with infantry, direct the driver, and maintain situational awareness. No human being on any battlefield could perform all those duties effectively. And so, in battle, our 35 commanders often fought blind, overwhelmed, exhausted, and isolated inside their rotating prisons. Then there was the weapon itself. A short-barreled 37mm cannon. It might have terrified infantry in 1918, but in 1940, it was hopelessly outclassed. German Panzer IIIs and IVs could take hits on the front plate and keep coming. Even Panzer IIs, light reconnaissance tanks, could survive the R-35's fire. Many crews knew instantly that they would have to get dangerously close to the enemy to even hope for a damaging shot. And getting close meant slowing down, looking for cover, repositioning. All while German tanks swept across France with speed and precision the R-35 could never match. The shock of Blitzkrieg was not just about firepower, it was about tempo. The French moved like it was still 1917. The Germans moved like it was already 1945. And in that world, the R-35 didn't just fail, it disintegrated. On the battlefield, the R-35 was humiliated. Many broke down before they ever engaged the enemy. Others were abandoned when their commanders realized they could not reverse in time, could not climb a hill in time, could not turn their turret in time. German anti-tank crews called the R-35 Die Rollend Sardenbuchs, the rolling sardine can. Not out of cruelty, but accuracy. Thousands were captured intact. German engineers inspected them and, with a mix of pity and practicality, converted many into artillery tractors or bunker vehicles. Even the Wehrmacht didn't consider them useful as tanks. And the most painful detail? Many R-35s that faced German armor didn't die by direct hits. They died when shells struck their brittle armor, causing it to fracture, sending lethal shards of steel flying inward, killing the crew even without penetration. It was a lesson paid for in blood. Armor thickness means nothing if the steel itself cannot withstand stress. Heavy steel is not the same as strong steel. By the time France fell, the R-35 had earned an unfortunate reputation. It was not the worst tank because it was the weakest. It was the worst because it represented an entire military philosophy trapped in the past. A tank built for trench warfare in a world that had moved far beyond trenches. And yet, like so many machines on our list, the true tragedy of the R-35 was not its construction. It was the bravery of the men inside. Soldiers who fought in a tank that could not keep up, could not hit back, and could not protect them when the moment came. If the L-640 was obsolete at birth, and the M3 Lee was a mistake assembled in desperation, then the Renault R-35 was something far worse, a tank that fought the wrong war entirely. And still, as shocking as the R-35's limitations were, our descent into the worst armored disasters of World War II goes even deeper. Because the next tank on our list didn't just fail tactically or mechanically. It failed conceptually, on a level so fundamental that historians still debate how it was ever approved. And so our journey moves from the French R-35, a tank trapped in the past, to a machine that wasn't even meant to be a tank at all. A machine that Germany sent into battle not because it was ready, but because the war arrived sooner than anyone expected. A machine that taught the world a brutal truth. When desperation meets ambition, soldiers often pay the price. This is the Panzer I. Imagine standing on the battlefield in 1939, watching the Wehrmacht surge forward in perfect formations. The world stared in awe as Germany unveiled the terrifying speed and coordination of Blitzkrieg, armored spearheads slicing through Poland and France like steel knives. But here's a secret buried beneath that sweeping triumph. The majority of those tanks weren't Panthers or Tigers. They weren't even Panzer IIIs. They were Panzer IIs, light, fragile vehicles armed with nothing but machine guns. That's right. Germany conquered half of Europe with tanks that couldn't penetrate the armor of almost any enemy vehicle. The Panzer I wasn't designed for tank combat. Its original purpose was simple: training. It existed so German crews could learn how to drive, how to load, how to operate as a tank unit, all while Germany rebuilt its military under the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles. It was never meant to go to war. But war doesn't wait for perfection. When Hitler launched his invasions, he needed numbers, any numbers. So the Panzer I was thrown into combat, despite having armor thinner than some door hinges and weapons no more powerful than infantry machine guns. Against enemy tanks, the Panzer I was helpless. Against anti-tank guns, it was suicidal. Even concentrated rifle fire or well-thrown grenades could cripple it. And inside each of these tiny machines sat two soldiers, a driver and a commander, doing everything they could to survive inside a box barely armored, barely armed, and barely functional as a weapon. The turret was so cramped that the commander had no room to breathe, let alone coordinate the battle. The armor plate was only a few millimeters thick, meaning the Panzer I could be penetrated by anti-tank rifles, heavy machine guns, and sometimes even lucky small arms fire at close range. Yet despite all this, Panzer I crews fought with extraordinary courage. In Poland, in France, in Spain during the Civil War, these tiny tanks were pushed into battles against superior enemies, often acting as distractions while heavier German vehicles maneuvered for advantage. But there's only so much bravery can do when the machine beneath you is fundamentally flawed. The tank's worst nightmare came in Spain, where it faced Soviet-supplied T-26 tanks armed with 45mm cannons. When the Spanish Civil War erupted into mechanized combat, the Panzer I was exposed instantly. Crews couldn't return fire, their machine guns bounced harmlessly off Soviet armor. They couldn't outrun them. They couldn't outshoot them. They could only take cover, pray for air support, or die where they stood. German officers took careful notes during the Spanish Civil War. They learned painfully that the Panzer I was not a tank, it was a placeholder. A symbol of Germany's industrial infancy. A reminder that quantity without capability comes at a terrible cost. But perhaps the most unsettling truth about the Panzer I is not its weakness, but its role in early German victories. Despite being one of the worst tanks of the war, its sheer numbers, thousands produced, allowed the illusion of unstoppable armored might. The world believed Germany had tanks everywhere, steel monsters rolling through Europe. In reality, much of the German victory in early war came from tactics, not tank quality. And that's what makes the Panzer I so haunting. It wasn't good. It wasn't ready. It wasn't safe. And yet it was used, relentlessly. German propaganda presented it as a symbol of strength. But to the men inside, it was a metal coffin waiting to close. By 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the Panzer I was hopelessly obsolete. Many were converted into command tanks, ammunition carriers, or flame tanks, anything but frontline armor. Others broke down on the vast Russian plains before they even saw combat. The ones that did reach the front often burned before firing a single shot. And still, despite everything, the Panzer I remains a critical part of our story. Because it teaches us that the worst tanks aren't always rare experimental failures. Sometimes, the worst tanks are the ones that were used anyway. The tanks rolled into battle not because they were ready, but because the war marched forward without mercy. And if you think the Panzer I was a disaster, wait until you see what comes next. Because the next tank on our list wasn't just weak. It wasn't just obsolete. It was a machine whose armor could be penetrated by bullets, and whose design flaws were so catastrophic that even its victories were accidents. The Panzer I proved that even a weak tank can change history if it's used in the right place at the right time. But the next tank on our journey didn't have that luxury. It wasn't saved by tactics. It wasn't protected by surprise. It wasn't overshadowed by better machines. No, the Type 95 Hago stood alone, exposed, vulnerable, and tragically unprepared for the brutal reality of modern warfare. If the Panzer I was a coffin made of steel, the Hago was a coffin made of tin. To understand why Japan built such a fragile machine, you need to understand the war they expected to fight. The Imperial Japanese Army imagined battles in jungles and islands, terrain where mobility mattered more than armor, and light resistance was the norm. Against infantry armed with rifles and machine guns, the Type 95 made sense. It was fast. It was agile. It could cross rough terrain and climb slopes many tanks would struggle with. But World War II didn't stay in the jungle. And neither did the Hago. The tank's first major test came not against unarmored warlord forces in China, but against modern, mechanized armies. And that's when the weaknesses, the deadly, unforgivable weaknesses, became impossible to ignore. Start with the armor. In some places, it was so thin that a heavy machine gun could punch through it. In others, the steel was riveted, not welded. Every rivet was a lethal fragment waiting to happen. When an enemy round struck the tank, even if it didn't penetrate, the impact could shear those rivets off the inside of the hull. They shot around the crew compartment like shrapnel, blinding, mutilating, or killing the men inside. Survival was not likely. Even non-penetrating hits could be fatal. Then there was the firepower. The Hago carried a 37mm gun, short-barreled, low-velocity, and nearly useless against anything other than lightly armored vehicles. Against American M3 Stuarts, it struggled. Against Shermans, it was hopeless. The rounds ricocheted off U.S. armor like stones thrown at a wall. But perhaps the most damning flaw was its design philosophy. Japan believed speed and numbers would compensate for strength. They were wrong. Dead wrong. This became painfully clear in the Pacific. At Guadalcanal, American Marines first encountered the Hago. Many had never seen a tank in combat before. But once they did, they weren't impressed. They were confused. This was the Japanese armored threat? Marines later joked that the tanks looked like angry metal insects, clattering forward, easily disabled, easily burned. In one infamous incident, a Marine with a Browning .50 caliber machine gun held his position as a Hago advanced. He opened fire, and the bullets tore through the armor. The Hago burst into flames before it had a chance to fire a shot. At Tarawa, it got worse. Many Hagos were destroyed not by anti-tank weapons, but by satchel charges, grenades, or direct small arms fire at weak points. U.S. soldiers realized quickly that these tanks were dangerous only to the soldiers trapped inside them. But it was on the plains of Manchuria, in the final weeks of the war, that the full tragedy of the Hago became clear. When the Soviet Union invaded, their T-34s encountered Japanese Hagos still being used in defensive lines. The results were horrific. A T-34 could destroy a Hago simply by driving over it. The crushing weight collapsed the Japanese tank like a thin aluminum can. The Soviets didn't even waste ammunition. They used their tanks as bulldozers. And yet, despite everything, despite its paper-thin armor, despite its weak gun, despite its catastrophic survivability, Japanese soldiers fought bravely inside these machines. They drove them into hopeless battles. They attempted ambushes against vastly superior armor. They did everything they could with a vehicle that had no business being on a modern battlefield. The Type 95 Hago wasn't just obsolete. It wasn't just weak. It wasn't just poorly armed. It was an armored illusion, a machine that worked only in the war Japan wished it was fighting, not the war it actually faced. But amazingly, the Hago still isn't the worst tank on our list. Because the next tank didn't just fail its crew, it failed its country. It was a tank that broke down before reaching battle, overheated under its own weight, and suffered from design flaws so unforgivable that even its creators tried to pretend it didn't exist. And that disaster is coming next. And now, after marching through the failures of Italy, America, France, Germany, and Japan, we arrive at the end of the road. The final tank in our journey. The machine that stands above all others as the most tragically misguided, mechanically unreliable, tactically useless, and historically embarrassing tank ever fielded in World War II. The Soviet T-35. A tank so large that it looked more like a land battleship than an armored vehicle. A tank so complex that its crew needed 11 men just to keep it running. A tank so unreliable that most never even made it to battle. And yet, in the Soviet Union of the 1930s, this steel giant was not seen as a disaster. It was seen as glory. The T-35 was born in an era when propaganda could be mistaken for engineering. Stalin wanted to demonstrate industrial might, armored supremacy, and technological dominance. And nothing said power like a 45-ton multi-turreted behemoth rumbling across Red Square. With 5 turrets pointing in different directions, the T-35 looked unstoppable, a tank that could annihilate entire infantry formations, machine gun nests, and armored columns all at once. But this illusion shattered the moment the T-35 left the parade ground. Because the tank wasn't built for war. It was built for photographs. The first problem was size. It was enormous, too enormous. The T-35 towered above the battlefield, visible from miles away, impossible to hide, impossible to maneuver, impossible to support. The longer the tank existed, the clearer it became. It was a metal billboard begging to be destroyed. Then came the engine. It was powerful, yes, but not powerful enough for the monstrous weight it was expected to push. Every incline, every trench, every patch of mud in the Ukrainian countryside became a threat. Transmissions overheated. Gearboxes failed. Engines seized. In practice, the T-35 could barely move under its own weight. If the enemy didn't destroy it, the tank would destroy itself. But mobility wasn't the only fatal flaw. Coordination inside the T-35 was chaos. With 11 men shouting over a roaring engine, each turret operating independently, and no practical internal communication system, the tank became a noisy, confused maze where commands were lost and crew members had no idea what the others were doing. Imagine trying to fight a battle in a steel echo chamber while operating 5 guns at once. It was madness. And then there was the armor. On paper, the T-35 seemed heavily armored. In reality, it was brittle, poorly constructed steel welded too thin in places, bolted too loosely in others. When German shells struck the T-35 in 1941, the armor cracked open like ceramic. Even moderate anti-tank weapons tore through it with ease. The tank that looked invincible in parades fell apart in real combat. But the final humiliation, the one that secures the T-35's place as the worst tank of World War II, came during Operation Barbarossa. When the German invasion began, dozens of T-35s rolled out to face the Wehrmacht. Not in glorious formation. Not in heroic counterattacks. They rolled out and died. Not by enemy fire, but by themselves. Engines overheated. Transmissions collapsed. Tracks snapped. Electrical systems shorted. Fuel lines burst. One after another, T-35s broke down on the road, their crews abandoning them before the enemy even arrived. Some were blown up by their own men to prevent capture. Others were simply left behind, sad hulking monuments to failed ambition. Out of all the T-35s deployed in 1941, not one single tank achieved a meaningful combat success. Not one breakthrough. Not one defensive stand. Not one recorded instance where the T-35 changed a battle. It died before it could fight. Which brings us to the final truth. The worst tank in World War II was not the weakest. Not the smallest. Not the least armed. It was the tank that embodied failure at every level. A failed concept. A failed design. A failed machine. A tank that could not perform the most basic function of a tank, to move, fight, and protect its crew. The T-35 was a tragedy of engineering, a disaster of doctrine, and the ultimate symbol of a military power trying to project strength while ignoring reality. It enters history not as a weapon, but as a warning that the battlefield does not care about appearances, a warning that complexity is not strength, a warning that armor must be earned, not imagined. And so, our journey ends here, with the T-35, the worst tank of World War II. A tank that looked unstoppable until it tried to move.